Are you looking to play competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Without having to sell a kidney to pick up the Fiendsmith cards? Well, this video's for you. What's up, everybody? Raiko here. Today, we're going to be going over some budget decks that can compete going into the competitive season post-Infinite Forbidden. With the Fiendsmith cards being introduced to the game, there's definitely going to be a high entry of payment to be able to afford some of these decks, whether or not you're looking to play Yubel, Snake Eye, or anything really that uses the Fiendsmith cards. You don't need to pick up the Fiendsmith cards in order to do well in Yu-Gi-Oh!, especially at a competitive level. And in this video, we're going to be going over a specific amount of decks that will definitely get you there. It may not be good as the Fiendsmith cards, but these decks on their own are definitely really solid. And if you're looking to compete, they're great options. But before we jump right into the first deck, make sure to go ahead and like this video and subscribe as well. It helps a bunch. If you're already subscribed, you're awesome. You really are. You know who you are. Thank you so much. With that, let's just jump right into the first deck. All right, so please keep in mind that these aren't in any specific order, but these are all decks that have their own unique play style, and there are different kinds of play style with these decks, but they're not going to cost you an absurd amount of money to pick up. And although you can increase the ceiling of some of these decks by picking up certain expensive cards, it's not necessary to do well. So that being said, let's jump right into the first deck. The first deck I wanted to talk about is actually one close to me, dear to my heart, and that's Tier Laments. I am so happy to say that Tier Laments is now turning into a budget deck, with Tier Cash being announced for a reprint in the newest Megatins. Also, Imseti getting a reprint as well. Tier Laments is looking to be a really solid budget option, especially since planets aren't as expensive as they used to be, given that it was reprinted in Rarity 2 as well. This deck, what can I say? Tier Lament seems to have always been relevant, and it's just a deck that can never die. But I'm okay with that because Tier is super fun to play. Not when your opponent draws Shifter, but it's super fun to play. There's so many different ways you can build this deck. As we saw from the NAWCQ with the top 64 list, you don't need the Horus cards, you don't need the Fiendsmith cards, and you could just play a Tier Lament pile and you can still do really well. Yes, SP Little Knight can increase your deck cost, and that goes for most of the decks on this list, but SP Little Knight got announced for a reprint in the tins as well, so it's only a matter of time until that price comes down as well. Overall, Tier Laments, it's a solid choice. Definitely a lot of interactions, whether it be from the field, from the back row, from the graveyard, or even the hand. You don't just lose to a single board breaker. And other than Shifter, you don't really lose to a single hand trap either. Yes, a well-timed Ash Blossom can cut you off from time to time, and now that people are playing Bystials in the main again, that could be a little difficult too. But you just have so much gas in Tier Laments that even if you get Crowed or Bystialed or Ash Blossom at certain places, you can still put up a really good end board and make it so where you're not just automatically folding to those cards. Jumping into the next deck I wanted to talk about, and that's Runestun. I know. Runic Stun is really annoying to play against. But in terms of budget competitive decks, this deck is definitely one of the more well-positioned decks going into this meta, given that it can play so many floodgates, it doesn't really lose out to certain board breakers and hand trap. Yes, an evenly matched can hurt it. Yes, if you have a skill drain up and your opponent dusters you, you can't protect it with Hugin. It still is a very, very solid deck, especially if you win the dice roll. And post-siding, you can side into cards like Lava Golem or Sphere Mode, which are incredible this format. Overall, Runic Stun, again, not the most fun deck to play against, but to play, it can definitely get you good spots and take you far in bigger tournaments, especially if played well. Going on to the next deck, we have Ritual Beasts. I know, Ritual Beasts. I can't believe in the year 2024, Ritual Beasts are good again. But you know what? It's got such custom support, and although it's one of the more difficult decks to play on here, it's a Shifter deck, and out of all the Shifter decks, it's arguably the best Shifter deck, and a lot of the cards just aren't really that expensive. Yes, Elder had its hype. Yes, Lara had its hype, but a lot of those prices did cool down, and now the deck is really affordable again. And what's so unique about this is you just don't need to pick up the Fiendsmith cards. This deck is solid, and it's a Shifter deck, but surprisingly enough, if Shifter's banned, this deck is still really good. And something that's so cool about this deck is if you pick it up, it's really good in the long term, because Ritual Beasts have an incredibly high ceiling, and you're not just going to be able to pick it up and play it. So it will take some practice, and you have to learn some combo lines and learn how the interactions work, but it is one of the most rewarding decks to play at a higher level, especially if you know what you're doing. Same thing with Tier Limit, by the way. It's definitely a higher ceiling, but once you know how to play it, it's definitely a solid deck. All in all, if you're wondering which deck you should be leaning towards this format, and you think Shifter's looking kind of nice, definitely consider giving Ritual Beast a try. I've been playing it recently, and it's a lot of fun. You will misplay, you will not do the best as you start the deck, but once you pick it up and you start playing it and you start learning the lines, it's such a fun deck to play. And yeah, I definitely highly recommend giving Ritual Beast a look at if you're looking for a solid competitive budget deck. The next deck I wanted to talk about is another Shifter deck. It's Fluandereeze. Yes, this deck, since its release, it only got one hit, and that's Barrier Statue. The rest, this deck is full power still. We still have 3 Map, 3 Rabina, 3 Pot of Prosperity, and yes, 3 Shifter. This deck, it can brick, but it's very, very solid. And what's so cool about this deck is you don't need the extra deck, really. So you don't have to buy an SP Little Knight. You don't have to buy all these expensive extra deck staples. All you really need to do is focus on the main deck, which you can pick up the whole entire core for under $20, and focus on the side deck. It can be very annoying to play against, but similar to Runestun, again, if you're looking for budget decks that will get you there competitively, you can't count Flu out. It can lose to 1 or 2 well-timed hand traps, and yes, it can lose to itself because it does brick from time to time, but it's still a solid deck. And if you go first and you open Rabina and your opponent doesn't have any interactions with you, you're looking pretty nice there. And it's also pretty good into board breakers as well, because if your opponent Dark Rulers you, you can just activate the trap and set up another M-Pen or set up an Omni Negate. Or if your opponent threatens to go to battle phase, you can just activate the trap and summon out your Miss Valley Apex Avion, which gives you an Omni Negate for evenly. So overall, it's a very, very solid option. But again, not a lot of people will like you too much if you're playing Flu at locals. Just saying. Going on to the next budget deck, changing up the playstyle a bit, we have Labyrinth. Yeah, Labyrinth is a budget deck now. Big Welcome Labyrinth have dropped exponentially in price, and so has Welcome Labyrinth. So you really don't need to spend a lot to play this deck. Yes, if you're playing something like Extravagance, you'll want to pick up multiples of extra deck monsters, but it's definitely not necessary. And if you're playing a more of a back row heavy version, it really isn't necessary. You don't need to pick up so many Chaos Angels or so many SP Little Knights. And even if you decide to go that route and you want to spend a little money to get that extra cards in the extra deck, SP Little Knight, again, got announced for a reprint. Chaos Angel got announced for a reprint. So these cards are looking to be a lot more affordable than what they previously were. But all in all, again, kind of like Flu, you don't really need to focus on the extra deck, and if you focus on a build such as using the Equation Cannon trap that a lot of Labyrinth players seem to be gravitating towards now, it's definitely a solid option. Yes, you have to do math on the fly, and that might steer some of you away from this deck, but it's very, very rewarding to the player who's more skilled with it. So if you're really looking for a deck to sink your teeth into and to get really, really good with, I recommend Labyrinth because it's just a solid deck and will always be relevant unless it gets hit on the ban list. Plus, setting any normal trap from your deck and being able to activate it that turn is nothing to scoff at. Going on to the next deck, we've got Gimmick Puppet. I know, a lot of these decks, if you're noticing, aren't really the most fun to play against, but in terms of the player as the one playing it, it can definitely get you there in terms of competitive play. Gimmick Puppet FTK is pretty absurd, and if your opponent doesn't really open any real interaction, or if they only have monster hand traps and you open the field spell, you're probably winning that game. And even going second, you can still do stuff like droplet your opponent's board and then activate the field spell and proceed to win, or you can resolve evenly, and you can do, there are lots of blowouts that help you going second as well. But all in all, in a best 2 out of 3, you do have to be wary that people are gonna side stuff versus you, and if this deck becomes more popular, people will side more things such as Kari Photon or other things to prevent them from taking damage. But overall, as of now, this is a really, really solid budget deck, and you don't really need to pick up stuff like SP Little Knight or Chaos Angel or the Fiendsmith cards. You just need to focus on your Gimmick Puppet cards, and that's it. Everything's low rarity. There's not one card that's above an ultra rare. All in all, this is a really, really solid budget choice. Again, you won't make too many friends at locals, but if you're going to a regional, if you're going to a YCS, bringing Gimmick Puppet as a budget deck, it's definitely a solid choice. And then the last deck I wanted to talk about, probably the strongest out of all of these, and that's Tenpai. Tenpai, yes, I would argue is a budget deck. You do have to pick up some expensive cards, but all in all, the whole deck, compared to Yubel or Snake Eye or a lot of other decks that have to play the Fiendsmith cards, you don't have to play the Fiendsmith cards. You just need to pick up one of the Synchros, which is the old Synchro. I'm forgetting, it's Trident Dragion, I believe. And that's pretty much it for the expensive cards. Everything's common, everything's super. And with the new Tenpai cards, there's an Ultra, yeah, but it's not even that expensive. It's I'm pretty sure it's under like $15 right now, under $10. So it's definitely a solid choice. Again, out of all the decks, this is probably the best deck for budget competitive play, but it's also kind of linear. So if you're looking for something that's a little more combo centric and something that has a higher ceiling, Tempai's not your deck. But if you're looking for a solid going second deck that can also play Shifter, by the way, and it can play a bunch of non-engine and it's budget friendly, this is definitely a really cool deck. Plus, it's a really satisfying and really gets your endorphins going when you can put up that much damage on a board. It's what, 36,000 damage or 37,000 damage, and you can OTK through Pot of Prosperity. That's absurd and not something to scoff at. And overall, this deck is just very strong. The field spell, being able to make all of your monsters just unaffected by your opponent's cards is absurd. And it's like the Gimmick Puppet field spell in a sense, but again, it gets you a once per turn search, makes all of your guys unaffected during the main phase. Very strong. Overall, out of all the budget decks mentioned, this is probably gonna give you the best shot at doing the best in bigger tournaments. But overall, that's the list. I'm wondering, did I miss anything? Are there any other budget decks that are really competitively viable? Let me know in the comments below. But thanks so much if you stuck around this long. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, peace.